Hi, Erev Tov to everybody. I hope everybody had a wonderful Hanukkah. We had a nice Hanukkah, ending by being wet, but it was very nice. So we're going to take a look at the second of two, I think, interesting and a little bit hard to understand psukim. So if you look at the top of the page, the verse that we're going to focus on is this one, but I just want to quickly read, and I really should have put it on the page, the verse that precedes it, which is also very famous. So I'll say it very quickly. And that verse, so they came up from, the brothers come up from Egypt, and they come and meet with Yaakov, and they say to him, Vayigash lemor, O Yosef chai, and they tell him, Joseph's alive. O Yosef chai. There's a yeshiva named O Yosef chai. There's a charity in Yerushalayim called O Yosef chai. So this expression, O Yosef chai, has become, we made it. We survived. We continue in spite of all the odds. It's a very powerful statement. But in the initial verse, the one that's not on the page, the initial verse, it says, V'yafag libo ki lo ha'amin lahem. His heart something, because he didn't believe them. And I've got 7 different translations in front of me. Became numb. His heart doubted. His heart became faint or fainted, stunned, stopped, failed. So it's like all of these, in other words, vayafag his heart. In other words, his, it's like, his heart, couldn't take the information. His heart was in his mouth. However, we're not sure exactly how best to translate this expression, but it meant that, he was stopped in his tracks. He didn't know what to think, right? So that then brings us to our verse. And our verse has 3 problems. Well, it could make more, but there are 3 basic problems. So the sons see that Yaakov Avinu is in shock over the information, and he's like not registering the information, in some way. So they said to him, "V'yadaber elav ekol divrei Yosef." So then they tell him everything that Joseph said. Okay? Asher diber Elohim said to them, V'yaret agalot asher shalach Yosef l'seitato. And then they saw the wagons that were brought to bear him down. V'techi ruach Yaakov avihim. And the spirit of Yaakov was revived. Okay? 3 things. Number 1, what were the things that they told Yaakov? Yosef said a lot of stuff. What was the specific message? Number 2, what's the business with the agalot? There's a famous answer about the agalot that probably most of you, I shouldn't say most, but some of you are already thinking, but we'll see a few interpretations of what is significant about the wagons. And then the most important of them, what does it mean when it says that his heart revived or his spirit revived? Now, as in the first, we've got, cardiac arrest, as I called it in the first pasuk. Now we've got something. We've got. Remember, I should have called this. I could have called it. We've got CPR. Now we've resuscitated Yaakov Avinu. So what does that mean? And there's some fascinating interpretations, especially of the third one. But let's begin with what was it that they told him? What was in the words that the brothers said to Yaakov Avinu? So I want to start with the second comment on the page, the Rashbam. What was it that they said? Okay, all the other things Joseph had spoken to them, about which they had already been recorded, such as that he wept while embracing them, so that they recognized that he was their brother. Okay, so what did he didn't, there was no message, there was no, secret code It was, they just started describing the scene. And that was Yosef doing that. The way they described his behavior, Yaakov could tell, that must be Yosef, and so he was revived. Okay, that's a fine shot. That's the Rashbam. Okay, the Sforno, the third comment on the page, they told him all the words. What were the words that they told him? Something that Yosef hadn't necessarily told him. They informed him that there would be another 5 years of famine in order that he would not faint from excessive joy. Okay, I don't like that second part, but I do like the first part. In other words, he gave them information that regular people wouldn't have necessarily known. That Yosef, who had direct communication through dreams with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? He knew what was going to happen. And so that, okay, that makes sense. I want to then go to 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth thing on the page, the Ramban. The Ramban is more interested in what they didn't tell, okay, than what they did. And they told him all the words of Yosef. It is my opinion, in line with the plain meaning of Scripture, of Tanakh, of the Psukim, that it was never told to Jacob throughout his entire lifetime that the brothers had sold Yosef. That he's more concerned with telling us what wasn't said. As they told him all of the things that had been said, but there was something that was left out. I think the Ramban sort of means that was something that wouldn't have helped Yaakov Avinu to revive his spirit. I think that would have been, I don't want to say it would have killed him, God forbid, but it wouldn't have put him in the right state of mind for what's coming up. That they never told him that. Rather, this is what Yaakov thought until his dying day. Rather, he thought that Joseph, had strayed in the field. Now that he went up north from Hebron or Beersheba, wherever they were camped at the time, probably Hebron, and he goes up north to Shechem, and while wandering around, he strays in the field, and those who found him took him and sold him into Egypt. He was kidnapped, had nothing to do with the brothers. Since he was a lone traveler, it was very dangerous. People in those days traveled quite often in caravans or in large groups. It was dangerous to travel. So the assumption was he had been kidnapped. Now what's interesting is they don't try to go back and say he still thought he was dead. In other words, he now believed their story that they met him and that the whole thing with the coat dipped in blood never gets really explained away. Even though we know what happened, it seems like Yaakov just accepted that as as just an unsolved detail. Maybe the kidnappers had done it or something. But we don't know what happens to that story. But they never revealed to him that they sold him, and the just assumption that there was a kidnapping. Okay. The brothers did not want to tell him of their sin. Why not? Being afraid for their lives, lest he be wroth, lest he be really angry. Why? And curse them as he did to Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. That when you look at the brachot at the end of next week's parsha, okay, in chapter 49 of Breshit, basically, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi get cursed rather than blessed. There are some positive parts, but they didn't want Yaakov Avinu to curse out the rest of them. So they just were keeping this secret. While Joseph is in good ethical conduct, did not want to tell him. And Yosef never mentions it. Even though Yaakov Avinu lives in Eretz Mitzrayim for 17 years, he never is told by either the brothers or by Yosef how Yosef got to Egypt. So Yaakov had to think on his own and come up with his own story. And sometimes, speaking as a parent, sometimes you just don't want to know. Oh, where was my son last night? Oh, I think I'd rather not. Now that he's home safely, I think I'd rather not know. I think that's, that kind of selective memory, I think, is part of parenting on occasion. Okay. While Joseph is in good ethical conduct, he didn't want to tell him. It's for this reason said, and they sent the message to Joseph saying, thy father did command before he died. So way at the end, they still, because they never told, they still were worried what Yosef would do when Yaakov died. So they said, it's like father sort of knew, and he made us, he wants you to know that you have to promise not to hurt us. Even though Yaakov didn't say it, they were still sort of lying. And had Jacob known of this man, it would have been proper for them to plead before their father rather than plead before Yosef at the time of the death to command Joseph by word of his mouth. For he would have granted his father's request and not rebelled against his word. And they would have not been endangered, nor would they need to feign words out of their own hearts. In other words, they lied later only because Yaakov never knew. If Yaakov had known, then they could have finessed the whole situation differently by, in the presence of Joseph, trying to convince Yaakov to make sure to protect them. Okay. So now I want to go to problem number 2. Those are the different things about what information was given over. Okay. What's this other thing about, before we go to the wagons, we're going to leave the wagons for last. What's this business about the spirit of Yaakov was revived? So I want to go to the top of the page, the first comment, which is Rashi, and I usually almost always put Rashi first. The spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. What does that mean? Well, was it, like I said, CPR? What was it exactly? Okay. The Shekhinah that had departed from him rested upon him again. Okay, let's continue this idea with the Radak at the bottom of the first page. Rabbi David Kimchi, writing about 150 years after Rashi did his commentary, his spirit, which had been as dead from shock, now revived. Our sages have said that the spirit mentioned in our verse, which was revived in Yaakov, was the spirit of prophetic insights. In other words, during the 22 years when Yosef was missing, Yaakov never talked to Hashem. He never had Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah, never had divine spirit, never had Nevuah. He was cut off, not just from his beloved son, he was also cut off from Hashem, that the communication between them was blocked by his mental and spiritual and psychological state, which is around 20 years ago. We have an ancient tradition, amply documented in history, that in the absence of joy in one's life, a person cannot enjoy such a spirit of prophecy. Prophecy requires the person to be in a good state of mind. People who are depressed, who are sad, in the dumps, cannot get prophecy. Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah, only comes to people who are in a spiritual and psychological good place. So that's why for 22 years he was in mourning. You never get over mourning for losing a child. He was in mourning. So because he was in mourning, he never had Ruach HaKodesh, no communication with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So what it means here is that his spirit was revived, meant he was now in a good spiritual place, and he could again get nevuah. And we're going to see right after this, 3 verses after this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to Yaakov. So for 22 years, he had no communication from Hashem. And now with this knowledge, with this information, he is revived in the sense that now he can get nevuah, and he can again talk to Hashem. Okay, on the way to Egypt at Beersheba, the prophetic spirit of Yaakov did indeed become manifest again, like I said, in the next 3 verses later. Okay, so that's a very powerful idea. One more mystical idea. If you could turn the page over temporarily, we're going to come back to a comment on the front page. If you could go to the second comment on the back side, which is the Shnei Luchot HaBrit. Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the Shalah, is Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz. I've spoken about him before. He's really an amazingly important personality because he made Aliyah from Eastern Europe in the beginning of the 1600s. He arrived in Tveria in about 1615, approximately, and he lived about a dozen years in Tveria before passing away, and he's buried. You can visit his grave in Tveria. It's one of the few graves in Tiberias that I think is an accurate place for where that person really lies. But okay, another historic issue I don't want to get into right now. But he wanted to come to Eretz Yisrael because he was inspired by the writings of the Ari, and he believed that you could only become truly spiritual in Eretz Yisrael. And so he came with a number of other Hasidim, and even though he lived before the Baal Shem Tov, a lot of his writings are the background to the Hasidic movement. And a number of his descendants become Hasidic Rebbeim. The most famous, I think, is the Bostoner Hasidim. Horowitz is direct descendants of his. So the second comment on the back side of the page says, in my commentary on Parshat Vayishlach, okay, which is 2 weeks ago, I've already explained the meaning of the statement that Jacob did not die. Now, there's a famous Gemara and Midrash at Vayechi, the end of Sefer Bereshit, that says that Yaakov Avinu never died, which is sort of funny to say because we read about him dying and we read about him being embalmed and being brought back from Egypt to be buried in Hebron, in Marta Machpelah. We don't usually take all of these, take care of all of these details for somebody who's still alive. So it's a question, what does this midrash mean when it says Yaakov didn't die? So the Shalah has an interesting explanation for that midrashic statement. Now, before I do him, I just want to mention that homiletically, I think this means that the spirit of Yaakov Avinu resides in us. That's how he doesn't die because we continue to live his principles and to live his ideals. And so therefore, Yaakov continues to live. But okay, that's homiletic. Now we're going to see something that's more Kabbalistic. Okay? I've already explained the meaning of the statement that Jacob did not die and how Jacob's death occurred when he received the news about Joseph's disappearance. So as Yaakov died when the brothers told him that Joseph was dead. They show him the coat with the blood. At that moment, Yaakov Avinu ke'ilu, as if you want to say, he was at that moment dead to the world, even though he was still going through the motions. He was a shadow of himself, okay? And how Jacob occurred when he received the news about Joseph's spirit, and how his soul was now restored. That's what our verse means when it says in our verse, "Vatichi ruach Yaakov avihem," and his spirit came back to life. So in other words, he died 22 years ago, and now he's back to life. Okay, what does that mean? What does that mean? He thus became his own reincarnation. Now, personally, I don't believe in reincarnation, which is perhaps not a popular thing to say, because a majority of traditional Jews today do believe in reincarnation. The Rambam never mentions it, but his son, Rav Abraham ben Rambam, says that his father didn't believe in it, and there were a number of early commentaries that were against it. The Ramban is the first really accepted authority that comes out in favor of reincarnation. And so it became popular. Today, I would say all Hasidim and most religious Sfardim, if not all religious Sfardim, believe in reincarnation. So that's already a majority of Datiyim, of religious Jews in the world. Amongst, modern Orthodox, Lithuanian Orthodox, it's a debate here and there. There's Reb Soloveitchik was against the concept. But I mean, it's commonly accepted. So what happens was he became his own reincarnation. So since he came back to life as himself, he was not subject to physical death. Death happened only to the Israel part of Jacob, Israel personality. This is the meaning of the verse coming up. The death of the person called Israel drew near, which we're going to read next week. So it's Yisrael dies, Yaakov somehow remains alive. So the Yisrael part of the Yaakov Yisrael personality and body gets buried, and somehow there's a Yaakov spirit still floating around the world. This is the meaning. The death of the person called Israel. The spiritual part of Jacob's soul called Israel was on a higher level than the spiritual part of the Nefesh called Yaakov. Yaakov's request to Jacob to perform a chesed shel emet, to a true charitable act, which was to bury him. And we say the greatest act of chesed is to help in the kivura, the funeral and the burial of someone else, okay, emanated from his Yisrael aspect, that he was taking care of the Yisrael aspect. The word imadi with me emphasized that he was speaking in his capacity as Yisrael. So in other words, somehow there's a spirit of Yaakov, not the body, and not the Yisrael part of his personality. All that got buried, but there's a Yaakov part of the personality still floating around in the world. I don't exactly understand how this works. Maybe it's entered into other people as reincarnations do, but I don't know. But somehow it's only the Yaakov part that's around, and that Yaakov part couldn't die because it was a reincarnation at the moment of these verses. A fascinating idea that I don't understand, but I figured it was worth sharing, because a lot of people today do believe in reincarnation, and that when we say Yaakov never died, that means that somehow there is the spirit of Yaakov still moving amongst us. Okay, if you could go back to the first part of the sheet, okay, and I want to the chizkuni. And now we want to talk about the last part that I skipped in the verse, and that is the wagons. So we spoke about what was it that Yosef said. We spoke about Yaakov's spirit reviving, his coming back to life, but we still want to talk about those wagons. What's important about those wagons? There's a very famous answer that we're going to get to, but I think there are more important, or in my eyes, more fascinating approaches. So the Chizkuni on the front page is talking about the wagons. so that Joseph had said, Yaakov reasoned that if the sender had not been my son, no one else would have gone to the trouble to send me carriages to be riding in on my journey. Rashi adds that the consonants ayin, gimel, lamed in the word agalah have a dual meaning. They can mean a heifer. They can also mean a young cow, or they can mean agalah, a carriage. Joseph reminded his father that the last subject that they had discussed when they learned Torah together were the laws of the egel arufah, the heifer, which is thrown off a cliff to atone for a murder committed by persons unknown. So if a person dies mysteriously between two communities, and we don't know the cause of death, we measure and say that the city that was closest, the town, the Jewish community was closest, is somehow responsible for the death of this individual. And the scholars and the spiritual leaders of this community come out, they kill a heifer, a young cow. But they say a vidu is saying, we didn't send him away. We are not responsible for his death. Not that we thought that these scholars killed him, but we want the communities to take responsibility for strangers so that they don't go wandering off between the cities where it's more dangerous. In other words, if someone comes to your town and it's getting late in the day, say, oh, you better stay here so that you don't get into trouble out on the road. Because the roads between cities in earlier periods were very dangerous. Okay, so that's what they were learning. And so the Agalah reminded Yaakov of the Egel because it's got the same Ayin Gimel Lamed letters. Okay. When the Torah reports Yaakov as having accompanied Joseph as part of the descent from the mountain of Hebron, so in other words, when Yaakov sent Yosef, he walked with him a little ways from Hebron. Joseph said to him, you should go back. In other words, there could not have been a connection to the subject of the Eglah Rufa, where sages assumed that the murdered person had not been accompanied, so it became the object of murder. But he remembered that they had discussed it. Okay, another approach, different explanation. Joseph had placed literal cows, heifers, on the carriages, which reminds his father of their last conversation in case they had forgotten. Okay, so that's one thing about the wagons. It was a reminder of that. The Dat Zakanim, look, the fourth thing on the front page, when he saw the carriages that Father Yaakov's spirits revived, he was aware that previously the Egyptian ruler had absolutely forbidden that any carriages leave the boundaries of Egypt. Now, why would the Pharaoh be so concerned that no wagons should leave Egypt? Now, we don't know for sure. It may be that the wagons could have held wealth. There are a lot of opinions, but the most fascinating opinion, I think, is that to pull a wagon, you needed horses. And the Egyptians wanted to keep a monopoly on horses because horses drew the Egyptian chariots, and the Egyptians didn't want their horses to get around the ancient world and could be used by other countries to attack them, because the Egyptian horses were the best horses for pulling these chariots in war. Chariots were a major part of the Egyptian army, as we know from the stories we're going to do in Shemot. And so they didn't let wagons pulled by horses leave. So that's the reason. There could be other reasons, but okay. But there was a law that they couldn't leave. Now, Pharaoh had relented and instructed Joseph to bring his family to Egypt by means of carriages. This turnaround convinced Yaakov that he and his family would be welcome in Egypt. Okay, so the wagons convinced Yaakov that Yosef was alive for two reasons. Number one, it reminded him of what the last thing they studied together. Number two, it reminded him or awakened in him this confidence that Yosef was alive, because only the king and really important people could get permission to send wagons. So Yosef must really be somebody, a macher, must really be somebody important in Egypt if they're going to send wagons. Okay, now let's turn to the back of the page, and we're going to go far afield from the Pshat. Those are the two attempts at understanding the meaning of the wagons, but we're going to see some other hashlachot, ramifications of the wagons. And let's begin with the Kedushat Levi. The Kedushat Levi is Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, and again, a mystic, a Hasidic Rebbe from the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. Okay. And so Reb Levi Yitzchak says, Joseph had hinted to Yaakov that he should not be concerned about his family going into exile. The wagons weren't to convince him so much that Yosef was alive. It was more to convince him it's okay to come down to Egypt, that somehow we'll take care of you in Egypt. Fascinating idea, okay? As what was occurring now was a forerunner of the eventual redemption from exile. Temporary hardship would result in much greater good in the end. It's okay to put yourself in a negative situation like exile, living in the diaspora, if it's for a purpose that in the end is going to be beneficial to you, to the Jewish nation. It's a temporary thing that's going to bring something better for the nation. Okay. Temporary hardship would result in much greater good in the end. Hopefully we all believe in that, it's what we believe, that one of the great things that young people can do to have a good life later in life is to take the pleasures of life and quite often push them off for later. That this ability to be comfortable with what you have now and to delay the gratification for a later time, we believe is psychologically a very successful way of making it through later life. Okay. Both the word agala, carriage, which is a chair or couch on circular wheels, the reason it's called a wagon is because the wheels are round. That is igul. They're circular, okay? It's got round wheels. Joseph wished to indicate to his father that temporary residence of his family in Egypt would result subsequently in his descendants inheriting the whole land of Israel. This idea is connected to something we say all the time. Ba'agala uvizman karib. Ba'agala, in the wheel, the turning of historical reality, and we hope swiftly. Ba'agala uvizman karib. And we use that expression often in our davening. And so, according to Kedushat Levi, sending an agala wasn't a reminder of this conversation and study that they had done together. It instead was a reminder of how history requires certain cycles, agala, circles, to get you through hardship and to get you into the place where you really belong. It's fascinating, and it's something I've mentioned in this class before. There are two famous theories of history. Most ancients believed in what was called the circle of history. that all history is circular. Everything that happened will return and come back, and things go down and they go up, and that all of history is a circle. Well, since the beginning of modern times, most philosophers and scientists believe that history is an arrow. It has a beginning and an end, and it moves inexorably in one direction. There's no going back. There's no repetition. What seems like repetition is just your imagination, okay? Jews believe in a combination of the two. We believe that history is a corkscrew. Not just because we like wine, but it's a corkscrew because it does have a beginning and an end, but we do repeat certain patterns in the system as we move forward. So we have this sort of compromised position between the two famous theories of history. Just to let you know that there are still people that believe that history is circular, because that's why if you look at the flag of India, there's a wagon wheel in the middle of the flag of India, because they believe that history is circular. That is Hindu culture and philosophy. Okay. Let's take a look. So that's the Kedushas Levi. Fascinating. Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Israel, obviously two very modern. Rabbi Sachs, Oliver Shalom, just passed recently, writing this about 10 years ago, writing about what Yaakov was thinking. Okay. Blending in for Jews has often been, oh, I'm muted? No, I'm not. Host me. Not now. Oh, okay. I probably had a problem with my sometimes with my internet, so then I apologize. Okay. But again, thank you for sending in the note. Okay. He'd be furnished with the best teacher at the office so he could blend comfortably. That's already a scary thought. Okay. Therefore, Pharaoh instructed Joseph to send wagons for the people, but not for their possessions. In other words, leave your stuff home. We're going to give you brand new stuff. Here in Egypt, we've got the best stores. Egypt invented IKEA. You can get everything brand new. Don't worry about anything. Okay? Joseph, however, knew that if this plan were conveyed to Yaakov, he would never come. He would never descend to Egypt. Because, on the contrary, Jacob would need assurances that every precaution was being taken to combat the possibility of assimilation. Yaakov would have been petrified of any attempt by Pharaoh to blend in with everybody else. When Joseph coached the brothers prior to their first meeting with Pharaoh, he told them to emphasize that they were shepherds. Why? From time immemorial, so that they would be sent to live apart in Goshen, for shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. If you remember last week, when the brothers had a meal with the Egyptians, with Yosef and with other Egyptians, they ate at different tables because the Egyptians wouldn't eat with shepherds, because they were farmers. When I read this, I sort of think about Oklahoma. I don't know how many of you remember the musical Oklahoma, okay? And it's about the farmers and the cowboys. The farmers and the cowboys can't be friends. That was one of the songs, okay? And at the end, it's about how the cowboys and the farmers can be friends, okay? But it's just an interesting this dichotomy between, animal husbandry and farming has always been separate. And there was actually a law in Eretz Yisrael in the time of Chazal that you couldn't keep sheep too close to cities because the sheep had to stay, X amount of distance away from cities because they would eat all of the vegetables and the crops that people were planting. And so this animosity between, farmers on one hand and any shepherds, cattle ranchers, doesn't make any difference, animals, and they just have to stay separate. Okay. For shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians, he realized that their ability to survive the Egyptian exile depended on their capacity to remain apart. It's very important that we, when we are in the diaspora, do a lot of things, not necessarily everything, but do a lot of things to make sure that we can differentiate ourselves from the general population. And Goshen was well suited to that purpose. Joseph told his brothers that he was going to inform Pharaoh, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me, hinting to them that they were not from the land of Canaan, but were still in the land of Canaan. Not that they, who used to be in Canaan, who they're still in Canaan. In other words, there's going to be a section of Eretz Yisrael called Goshen that's really little Canaan, right? Like cities used to have little Ireland or little Italy or, Chinatown, right? That idea, which in America usually lasted for a generation or two, but in Egypt, this was going to last for 210 years, for the entire extent of the exile, because we were destined to stay separate. And we had to work on it. Despite temporarily residing in Egypt, okay, that there are people that are careful to express themselves. I might be in Galut, but I really, but my heart is in Eretz Yisrael. And this is the famous quote from Menachem Begin, Oliver Shalom, when he became prime minister. A lot of Americans didn't know him, so they sent a lot of people to interview, and there was a very famous interview in Time magazine, and that was infamous because they wrote Begin, B-E-G-I-N, rhymes with Fagin, and Fagin, of course, is a negative character, perhaps an anti-Semitic character in Dickens' story of Oliver Twist, but that was so got influence. But he was asked where he was born, and he said, "I was born in Jerusalem, but my mother happened to have been in Brest-Litovsk at the time." Brest-Litovsk, of course, is Brisk. It's today in Belarus. In those days, it was the Russian Empire. So I was born in Yerushalayim. Just so happened my mother was in Europe at the time. So in other words, there's like a spiritual birth and there's a physical birth, and we can separate the two. Beautiful idea from Menachem Begin, Oliver Shalom. Okay. The sages tell us that the study halls and shuls in exile are parts of Eretz Yisrael, transplanted to foreign soil. We're supposed to see our Beit Knesset or our Beit Midrash in Brooklyn or Golders Green as being a little piece of Eretz Yisrael. It is in them and around them that we must build a temporary physical dwelling place that is spiritually rooted in the holiness and purity of Eretz Yisrael. And there are a lot of halachas about how to behave in a Beit Knesset or in a study hall, in a Beit Midrash, that would reflect the fact that we saw this as like a little piece that was outside whatever country of exile we were in. As long as one is physically prevented from being in Israel, he must transplant Israel to foreign soil. In this way, the Jew insulates himself from assimilating into the host society and culture. We hope so. Doesn't always work, but it may work for a while. We know that there were wonderful communities, whether you're talking about in Europe or go back to the ancient world in Bavel, where the Jews just disappeared over time. Over time, if you stay out of Eretz Yisrael long enough in one country, eventually you will become assimilated. But Rabbi Sachs is giving advice based on the Goshen, Egypt experience of what you can do to prevent it as long as possible before you can make it back to Eretz Yisrael. Fascinating idea, and that's what's going on in Yaakov's mind as he departs from Egypt in 2 more verses. Okay, good. Left myself enough time. Rabbi Alex Israel, who teaches at Yeshivat Har Etzion. I often have some of the wonderful teachers from the Gush here on the sheet. And Rabbi Alex Israel wrote, Yaakov takes some time to react to the shocking news. That's an interesting insight that I like. In other words, last week's Parshat, or the previous Pasuk, the previous Pasuk says, his heart, stopped beating, but now with more information and he starts to think about it, he's somehow revived. So, but the way Rabbi Israel is explaining is it took time to assimilate this new information, to deal with it. It wasn't easy to deal with. At the beginning, it all seems too much to be believed. That's what it meant. V'yafog libo is the v'yafog libo, and his heart was numb or was stunned or temporarily stopped or whatever it might be, was faint, okay? At the beginning, it all seems too much to be believed. Yosef is alive. Oh, Yosef, hi. The V'chayim Meitim bracha that we recite, isn't that a sign of the possibility of reincarnation? I don't think so. I think that the Chayim Meitim bracha is talking about not that we come back as another body in this world, but that there is another life elsewhere that is not Gilgul Neshamot, that is not reincarnation, that is a form of eternal life, but not here. Tchiyat HaMeitim is in a new setting. It's not that we around us there are, although there are people that believe there are. I have to be careful how I say this because I don't want to say this other opinion is wrong. It's just that I personally don't subscribe to it. There are people that believe, like the Hindus and like other groups, that around us right now, there are people who are the reincarnation of someone who lived before. The Ari Zal actually said that he was the reincarnation of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. There are such things said in Jewish tradition. I don't subscribe to that position. Tchiyat HaMeitim means that there will be in a new situation a revival, not a coming back to life, but not that in this world we are reincarnations. Okay. I don't mean to upset or disturb anybody. That opinion is very popular, but personally, and I think it's the sheet of the Rambam, we all believe in Tchiyat HaMeitim, that there will be some revival of some sort, but that doesn't mean that you come back as another person and, that somebody around you has somebody else's soul. That I don't subscribe to that. Okay. Sorry for that, but I hope I answered the question. Okay. Yes, we do believe that that your soul will come back someplace, but I don't think it'll be I think it'll come back as you, not as somebody else. Okay. How could he be, Yosef is alive? How could he be the ruler of Egypt? Indeed, I wonder how many people would believe such an incredible story. I mean, really, I mean, it beggars credulity that this could have happened, that he's not only is he not dead, but he's viceroy of Egypt. It is something out of the world of fairy tales to imagine that a son presumed dead is in fact the head of a state of a superpower, the head of state of a superpower. The Torah here records 2 stages. And this goes back to the idea that it took Yaakov time to deal with all of this, right? Which is very, very important, I think. And I think important to understand. The Torah here records 2 stages in Yaakov's acceptance of Yosef's current situation. First, they recounted all that Yosef had said to them. So there were things in their report of the conversation that rang true. They said, Yosef would have said that. Oh, yeah. That sounds like Yosef. That's stage 1. Second stage, Yaakov saw the wagons that Yosef had sent to transport him. So the first one is, Yosef must be alive because only Yosef would have said that. And Yosef must be an important personage because he could send wagons. Okay? 2 stages of this. Obviously, as the brothers recount the story and the meeting with Yosef, Yaakov begins to see the impossible as possible. I like that. And I think Jews live with this reality. It's like waking up on the second day of the 6-day war. We saw the impossible as possible. Or waking up after Hakamat Medina. We Jews sometimes see the things that we thought were impossible are indeed possible. That's a beautiful idea, and it's something that makes Jews special. And then he begins to accept the strange truth of the story. Nevertheless, what tips the balance for Yaakov is seeing the carriages sent by Yosef. Rabbi Israel thinks that's pshat in the pasuk. It's not the words, it's the sight of the wagon that convinced him. Perhaps we can now explain the phrase Yaakov's spirit was revived. Now we saw pshatim on that. It was revived because he could get nevuah, prophecy. He could speak to Hashem again. But here it means something else. In the view of these midrashim, physically, Yosef is intact. Is he spiritually whole as well? That's what was bothering Yaakov. I love this idea, and it's not something that dawned on me. The thing that was so important to him was, okay, I accept that he's alive, but is Yosef still Yosef? He left when he was 17, and now he's 39. Is he still the same tzaddik that left here? Is that true? The symbol of the wagons informs his father quite clearly that Yosef has retained his spiritual orientation. He has persisted against all odds in his commitment to Torah and to Judaism and to the mission of the family of Avraham Avinu. Now Yaakov's spirit in particular can be revived. This is a totally new way of looking at it that I really, really like. And he's talking like a parent. In other words, yeah, it's wonderful, and I believe you that he's alive, but is Yosef still Yosef? And then there's something about the wagons that says, he's still Yosef. It doesn't make any difference what the symbolism is. What's important is the 2 stages. First, he had to believe that Yosef was alive. That's the first part. The second part is something in the wagons told him, and he's still Yosef. This is important, okay? This is similar to the famous midrash when Yaakov encounters encounters Esav and says, "Im Lavan garti, I dwelt with Lavan, but Taryag mitzvah shamarti, but I'm still a ben Torah." I survive not just physically, but spiritually. And that is what revives the spirit of Yaakov. Not just that his son's alive, but his son has remained the tzaddik he was when he left here 22 years ago. That's the bigger miracle. It's one thing to survive. It's something else to remain who you were before this horrendous experience. And that's what makes Yosef the tzaddik, that he maintains his personality and his commitment to Torah, to mitzvot, and to the mission of Klal Yisrael. And I think that that's very powerful. And I love that idea. And that's the idea I want to leave you with this evening. Okay, so thank you so much for joining this evening. If people didn't make it tonight, let them know that Bli Neder, I'll get this up tomorrow. Okay?
Thank you.
Very welcome. Have a good night, everyone. Okay. Bye-bye. See you next week, Be'ezrat Hashem.